Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's funny when I start talking because it's always that slight squint. He really does look like a 12-year-old in real life. It's that squint. Taking the evening off for paper round to speak to you all today, so a lot of sacrifice has gone in. It is great to be at this college. I hope you will forgive me because I have never myself been here, which is an absolute scandal. It's already been heckled by someone. That normally only happens when my mother's here. So it is great to be here because it's obviously a college with a fantastic history, an inspiring history, a college founded by Christian socialists back in 1854. I hope I've got that right. And it moved here in 1905, of course. But a history of challenging the idea that education belongs to a small elite, that instead education is something that belongs to us all, that it's a right, not a privilege, whatever our background, whatever our age. And that's a principle, of course, we all, I think, need to defend in every single way that we can. And when we talk about education, it's interesting, education, as a word. It means lots of different things. It can mean, in a kind of more formal, academic sense. It can mean social education, what makes us well-rounded human beings, how we learn from each other through love, friendship, and so on. There's also another form of education, which I think is also extremely important. And that's how we educate each other about the many injustices that don't just mark our society, but that define our society, and how we educate each other about how we confront those injustices and how we build a very different sort of society indeed. And that is an education which isn't delivered by people like myself standing on a platform, cocky, prepubescent-looking writers addressing audiences. It happens through all of us together, organising and sharing experiences. And whenever I do talks like that, like this, that's the whole point. It's for us to talk with each other, to always leave more hopeful than when we entered the room in the first place, which is the number one principle. But that's how we really, I hope, will educate each other tonight, by talking and sharing experiences, by talking about the sort of society in which we live. And I suppose that's my big caveat. I never wanted to be a writer. Whoops. What I did want to do, in however modest or limited a way an individual can ever do, and as a socialist, I believe change happens through people organising together and using their collective strength to change society on the basis that individuals can never themselves change things by themselves. It's only by linking up with others in similar situations on the basis that you share a common enemy that you ever get change. But it's to try and get a discussion, a debate going about the sort of society we live in and what we do about it. And by the end of this discussion, that's what I want us to focus on. That we don't just have what I hope will be a nice and interesting discussion and go home and think, we talked about the many injustices of our society and that's all well and good and that's the end of that. But actually we all commit to doing something to changing that society. And that's what tonight is all about. And if I'm going to talk about the book, just in terms of why I wrote it, my main motives, it was this. Ever since this crisis began, people's anger at their situation and at the fate of this country, that anger has been redirected away from those at the top of society, those with power, to people's neighbours down the streets instead. Unemployed people, benefit claimants, foreigners, public sector workers, anyone but those responsible for the plight of the people of this country and for the country as a whole. And it's the politics of envy. Odd thing to say. People like myself, when I say those at the top are booming like they've never boomed before, while so many people struggle, maybe they should pay a bit more money. Well, that's the politics of envy. But those with power ceaselessly and remorselessly promote the politics of envy. They try and get struggling people to envy each other rather than being angry at those with power. That low-paid workers whose wages are being cut in real terms by their bosses, whose in-work benefits are being slashed by this government, that they should be angry, not with the boss, not with the government, that they should instead envy the unemployed person living in luxury down the road in a mansion made entirely of widescreen television sets. That private sector workers whose pensions have been decimated, one of the great scandals of our time, that they should not be angry with their bosses, but they should envy the teacher or the nurse whose pension is still intact. Why should they have a pension when you have no pension privately yourself? Or they say to the family, you can't get an affordable home because successive governments have refused to build council housing in this country. Or they can't get a secure job because secure jobs have been stripped from our economy by policies of economic and industrial vandalism, that you should not be angry with those with power. You should envy the immigrant who's got the home or the job that should rightfully be yours instead. And what they say to people is, you're being robbed, so your less deserving neighbour should be robbed as well, rather than asking why anybody is being robbed in the first place. So I have an unashamed message. And my unashamed message is that it's those with power who should be challenged, those with power who should be scrutinised and fought. It's interesting as a country that we have Benefit Street. We didn't have Tax Dodger Street, did we? And we didn't have Bankers Street either. What does that tell us about the sort of society in which we live? That we're constantly told to scrutinise and criticise and attack the behaviour of those at the bottom of society, rather than focusing our fire at those with power instead. That should be anything but a statement of the obvious, that we should challenge the powerful rather than those at the bottom of the heap, I think says a lot about our society, but that's the whole point. And for me, I'll be honest, I'm not massively interested in whether or not people agree with what I say in my book or not. Just by having a discussion about the powerful for a change is in itself, for me, a result. And that's all I want us to do. Now, what I want to do to start with is talk about a man called Steve Harley. If the modern British establishment wanted a public ambassador, Steve Harley would be a pretty good bet. He's the relatively youthful, smooth chairman of Ernst & Young, one of the big four accountancy firms in this country. They boast an annual turnover of $24 billion a year. But he's a striking break, from the kind of stuffy public school stereotype of the British boardroom. A northern lilt still lingers in his voice, probably stronger than what remains of my own. He was born in Harrogate in Yorkshire. He jokes to me, Harrogate's quite posh, isn't it? But he ended up growing up in a terraced house in Bury, 200 yards away from Giggle Lane, Bury Football Club's football stadium. He's smiley, he's down to earth, he passes, that kind of cliched bloke you'd have a pint with down the pub test. When he goes back home, he hangs out with the people he grew up with. It's just like it was when they were young, except maybe he's buying the first round. But he's late when he turns up. I meet him in the incredible kind of, huge, impressive Ernst & Young headquarters in London Bridge. This beautiful panoramic view of London's skyline. And he's late turning up because he was at the LGBT charity Stonewall's event the night before. Boy George was on the decks. He's proud of the fact that Ernst & Young are LGBT Employer of the Year. He's proud of other things too. He backs social entrepreneurs. One project he's really proud of is Bike Works, which takes ex-prison offenders and trains them up to be bike mechanics. Another organisation treats those he describes as underprivileged women, works with them and gets them back into work. They're really inspiring women, he says. So I get a lot from that. Here's the thing. Steve Harley is a genuinely well-intentioned man. He thinks he's helping people. Few members of those I would describe as the establishment are psychopaths. Now, I don't know if anyone's read John Ronson's The Psychopath Test. In that, he points out about 1% of the population are psychopaths. How many people do we have here tonight? Sorry. But amongst the British boardroom, he says it's 4 times higher, but that's only 4%. That means 96% are not Hannibal Lecters in the making, which is reassuring. Most people like to rationalise what they do, that in some way it's for the good of others, or at least not harmful to others. You like to come home after a day's work, whoever we are, and think, maybe I contributed something. But this is what Ernst & Young do. Ernst & Young are part of a systematic, industrialised attempt to avoid tax on the part of wealthy individuals and large corporations in this country, a practice which is worth an estimated £25 billion each and every year. £25 billion at a time of unprecedented, in generations at least, cuts to public services. We don't have enough money, we're told. Hence, benefits have to be cut for disabled people, unemployed people, working people. The bucks have to be balanced on the backs, admittedly, of those at the bottom of society. He talks of helping women, underprivileged women, in Britain in 2014. Hostels for women fleeing domestic violence, on average, turn away 230 women every single day. In a country in which 1.2 million women a year face domestic violence each year. In a country in which 1 to 2 women are killed by a current or former partner every single week. Those hostels can't meet need because there isn't enough money to keep those hostels open. At a time of systematic industrialised tax avoidance, where public services are being slashed, where disabled people are expected to pay a bedroom tax on the basis they have a spare room, again, to pay for a deficit and a crisis they didn't cause. It reminds me of a quote by Francis Beckett, the biographer of the post-war Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee. If a rich man wants to help the poor, he should pay his taxes gladly, not dole out money at a whim. Because Steve Harley's philosophy is a return to the Victorian ethos, that instead of having a welfare state and public services provided on the basis of progressive taxation, that you contribute on the basis of how much wealth you have, instead you should depend on the generosity and goodwill of wealthy individuals who, as acts of charity, of munificence, who, depending on their own conscience, will dole out money in order to help you. A lottery, of course, and it was a system swept away most dramatically by Clement Attlee's post-war Labour government. But look, Steve Harley, a well-intentioned, charming man. He has a very quick defence to this, and it is a compelling defence. Hang on a minute. This isn't fair. Tax avoidance is legal. Tax evasion is illegal. That's when you're going literally against the law itself in order to not pay taxes you're legally obliged to pay. Tax avoidance is just finding loopholes. You're going against the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. You're finding ways to not pay taxes that Parliament expects you to pay, but you're not breaking any laws by doing so. So Steve Harley's defence is very simple. If you're angry about this, don't take it up with us. Take it up with the government. They're the ones drawing up the legislation. One small problem. The big four accountancy firms, Ernst & Young included, helped draw up the tax laws in the first place. So according to the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee last year, individuals from these big accountancy firms advise governments, go back to their firms and advise their clients on how they can use those laws to reduce the amount of tax they pay. In other words, they are seconded to the Treasury. They help advise on drawing up the legislation, and then they tell their clients how to avoid the very legislation they themselves have drawn up partly in the first place. So take KPMG, another of the big four accountancy firms. They seconded staff to the Treasury to focus on developing what are known as controlled foreign company and patent box rules, which I won't go into because it's not that interesting. But after offering advice, KPMG produced brochures on these rules, boasting of their role in advising government. The brochure Patent Box, What's in It for You, suggests the legislation is a business opportunity to reduce UK tax. According to the Public Accounts Committee, large accountancy firms are in a powerful position in the tax world. They have a very good understanding of how HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, applies tax law, which they can then use to advise clients on which arrangements HMRC, our tax authorities, of course, are likely to challenge. They can identify loopholes in new legislations quickly. Now, the problem is, these big four accountancy firms, well, their tentacles are everywhere. So, PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the other big four accountancy firms, They offer free advice worth more than £250,000 each year to Labour front benches. According to the former key tax official in this country, Dave Hartnett, the former head of HMRC, and he was often characterised by opponents of tax avoidance campaign, who were campaigning against tax avoidance, and he's characterised as a stooge for tax dodging businesses. But in 2011, he wrote a seminal document for HMRC. It became known as the Hartnett Review. Now, as a senior tax official, Richard Brooks put it to me, a former senior tax official, the report said that most large companies don't avoid tax. And that was false, he said, and they knew it was false. I did protest about it internally. I showed them the evidence produced from the Revenue's own database, and it showed it wasn't true. More than half of the companies reviewed had an avoidance scheme that we were investigating. But when Brooks spoke out, he was dismissed as naive. Note a term often used against anybody who dares to oppose the status quo. But in 2012, to emphasise Hartnett's soft touch with big business, anti-tax avoidance activists stormed an extravagant black tie event at Oxford, presenting him with mock awards for services to the likes of Vodafone and Goldman Sachs. One of my friends amongst them, until they were ejected by a Hartnett associate who was filmed yelling, "This is an unlawful conspiracy to trespass. You will depart immediately before we set the dogs on you." It's all filmed. It's all on YouTube if you're interested. But their trespass would be vindicated. Because who did Dave Hartnett end up working for when he stood down from HMRC, one of our absolute key tax official in this country? Well, his new job was, of course, at a Big Four accountancy firm, Deloitte. Hartnett is a prominent example of what we can call a revolving door between civil service, government, and big business. But he's hardly a one-off. According to those well-known lefties, the Financial Times, in the last decade or so, 18 ex-ministers and former civil servants ended up with a Big Four company. Others include 2 former New Labour Home Secretaries, a former Director General at HMRC, a former head of the Number 10 Policy Unit, a former advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister, and so on. Here, as the comrades at the FT put it, was a sign of the symbiotic relationship between governments and the companies at the centre of recent tax avoidance rows. But it goes beyond kind of secondments. It goes beyond revolving doors. HMRC and these Big Four accountancy firms, they work together on a practically daily basis. According to a Freedom of Information request, Dave Hartnett met the senior British partner of Deloitte alone, David Cruikshank, 48 times between 2007 and 2011. According to that former senior tax official, Richard Brooks, Cruikshank and Hartnett did deals all the time. They were a big double act. Big companies knew if you want a good deal from the Revenue, go to Cruikshank, he'll sit down with Hartnett and do a deal. I want to return to the point I made about the law, about the legality of this. Because again, a very easy response to something is a very glib response, but an easy response. People like myself often make a comparison between tax avoidance and benefit fraud. Now, there's a very obvious reason for doing that. Benefit fraud, it's estimated by the government, it's about 0.7% of social security spending, £1.2 billion a year. Tax avoidance, on the other hand, as I said, estimated at 25 billion. Quite a disparity there. But a very easy response to that. Hang on a minute. As we've already said, tax avoidance is legal. Benefit fraud is illegal. And therein is the point. The law exists to crack down on the misdemeanours of the poor, but to facilitate or even encourage the far more socially destructive behaviour of those with power. Benefit claimants are not being seconded to the Department of Social Security to draw up legislation on social security. You laugh, it's ridiculous. Let alone benefit fraudsters drawing up the legislation. But how is that any less ridiculous than accountancy firms up to their necks in tax avoidance, drawing up tax laws and telling their clients how to avoid the legislation they're helping to draw up? And that's what speaks volumes about the sort of society in which we live, that sense of one rule for those at the top and one rule for everybody else. Now, that was brought into sharp relief, or it should have been, by the financial crisis. Because the banks, which I hope we'd all accept, plunged this country into economic calamity, they were not bailed out by free market dogma. They were bailed out by the state. Hundreds of billions of pounds of public money to prop them up. Britain's most lavished benefit claimant. And yet, a difference with other benefit claimants. Because all too few conditions attached. Carrying on paying more bonuses than every single other European Union country put together. With a government which took the EU to court to stop them capping those bonuses. Where they pay more extravagant salaries to those at the top of those banks than even their predecessors, not known for their restraint, could even have dreamt of. Not lending to small businesses, helping to choke off an economic recovery from a disaster they cause. Huge state largesse, but so few conditions. But compare the benefit claimants at the bottom of society, including people driven out of work precisely because of the behaviour of these people at the top bailed out in the first place. That support, ever more conditional or simply stripped away altogether. And one striking example of that is benefit sanctioning. Hundreds of thousands of unemployed people each year have their benefits sanctioned. For those who don't know what that means, it means that your benefits are stopped for a period, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe more, on the basis that you have failed to abide by the strict conditions attached to receiving support from the state. Now, these stories often, the reasons are so arbitrary and ridiculous, it defies belief, but I want to give you an example. I think it's important not to just focus on statistics, but flesh out what it means for human beings. I want to give you an example. A 60-year-old man in Manchester, an army veteran, selling poppies for the Royal Legion, selling poppies for maimed and injured former comrades of his. He tried to look for work. It's often hard at that age, if you're 60 years old, to find work again. But he tried hard. He tried applying for a job at a supermarket where he was selling poppies. He didn't get the job. He had his benefits sanctioned. And he had his benefits stopped on the basis that his volunteering for the Royal Legion showed he wasn't trying hard enough to look for work. Compare and contrast. Almost unlimited state largesse for those at the top of society, but so few conditions. Whilst for those at the bottom, that state support ever more conditional or taken away altogether. Socialism for the rich. Capitalism, sink or swim, for those at the bottom. And that socialism for the rich characterises so much of this modern establishment which rules over us. Whether it be privatised railways, subsidised by the state with far more subsidies than the days of nationalised British Rail. Whether it be the fact that half of all public sector spending now goes on private contractors like G4S or A4E. Whether it be state spending on research and development that these companies all depend on, infrastructure like road or rail, tax credits and in-work benefits subsidising the low pay of workers because employers aren't paying them enough for them to even live on. And that puts this mass tax avoidance in stark relief, that you depend on the largesse of the state whilst refusing to contribute in the first place, scrounging off the state, if you will. Now, if I was going to define this establishment, I know I've given a few examples of how it operates and how it behaves, but the way I look at it is it's made up, as it's always been, of powerful groups that need to protect their position in a democracy in which almost the entire adult population has the right to vote. This establishment represents an attempt on behalf of these groups to kind of manage democracy, if you like, to make sure it doesn't threaten their own interests. In this respect, you could see it as a firewall that insulates them from the rest of the population. As the well-connected right-wing columnist and blogger Paul Staines, better known as Guido Fawkes, put it approvingly, we've had nearly a century of universal suffrage now. And what happens is capital finds ways to protect itself from, the voters. Now, back in the 19th century, as calls for universal suffrage gathered strength, there were fears in privileged circles that if you extend the vote to the poor, that would pose a mortal threat to their own position. That the lower rungs of society would use their newfound voice to take away power and wealth from those at the top and redistribute it more evenly throughout the electorate. According to the conservative statesman Lord Salisbury, who would end up Prime Minister of this country in 1866, he said, if you give working class people the vote, it would tempt them to pass laws with respect to taxation and property, especially favourable to them, and therefore dangerous to all other classes. He carried on, in proportion as the property is small, the danger of misusing the franchise will be great. The poorer the person, the more dangerous it would be if they ended up with a vote because of what they would do with that newfound power. In the end, of course, those who rule this country were more frightened by what would happen if they refused to give people the vote, that they would be swept away by violent social revolution. And so by 1918, after much struggle, all men and some women had been given the franchise. But then again, the worries of those 19th century opponents of the vote were not without foundation. They were not paranoia at all. Because as a result of democracy, of all people having the vote, you did get attempts to redistribute wealth and power more evenly throughout society. You did get challenges to that concentration of wealth and power. You did end up with a welfare state, progressive taxation with higher taxes imposed on those at the top of society, rights in the workplace, a national health service, nationalisation and constraints on property. All of these things did happen. These were not fears which proved to be without foundation. And so this is how I'd look at the establishment which we face today. That those constraints, these, if you like, the wealth, the attempts to redistribute wealth and power, well, we've seen a backlash against that. That, if you like, we've seen an attempt to claw back the wealth and power that was redistributed because of the advent of democracy in this country. Today's establishment is legitimised by institutions and ideas that legitimise and protect the concentration of wealth and power in so few hands. A society in which the wealth of the top 1,000 people can double, as it's done in the last 5 years, during a period of economic trauma, whilst at the other end, nearly 1 million people are driven to food banks, in the 6th richest country on the face of the earth, unable to even afford to feed themselves, where working people have suffered the longest fall in living standards since Lord Salisbury made that speech back in the 1860s. That establishment represents that backlash, an attempt to claw back the wealth and power which had been redistributed because of democracy. Now, the interests of these people who dominate our society, they're often disparate though. They often conflict with each other. They include politicians who make laws, who I'll describe, media barons who set the terms of debate and make sure they're always favourable to those with wealth and power, businesses and financiers who run the economy, and so on. For me, though, the establishment is where those interests and worlds intersect with each other, either consciously or unconsciously. It's not some grand conspiracy. They're not sitting in smoke-filled rooms, puffing on cigars, dreaming up ever more creative and devious ways to grind the faces of the poor into the dirt. It doesn't have to work like that. Instead, they're bound together by shared economic interests and shared mentalities, particularly a common mentality which holds that those at the top deserve their wealth and power, which you could sum up with the advertising slogan of cosmetics giant L'Oreal, because I'm worth it. That mentality is what has driven politicians to bill for expenses, businesses to avoid tax, and city bankers to demand ever greater bonuses while plunging the world into economic disaster. Now, I want to use politicians as an example, because to be a politician, the traditional idea is that it's a service. You're there to represent your constituents. You're there as a duty almost. But politics has become increasingly professionalised. It's become treated as another upper middle class profession like any other. But if you start to see yourself as an upper middle class professional, then you'll start to compare yourself to other people who you think are in the same category. But these politicians, I mean, they're in the top. If you're a backbencher, you get £67,000 a year, top 3% by income. But then you look at the city bankers and city lawyers and think, hang on, look at how much these people are getting. They're in the top 0.0001% by income. Why aren't we getting a slice of that? I mean, they're partly benefiting from our policies, for Christ's sake. But this is the thing. What they did, because they knew they couldn't vote to increase their salaries, it wasn't politically possible. But in expenses, was a means to top up those salaries, to give them the salary that they thought they deserved more. But it goes beyond the expenses scandal. Because what's happened is politicians and the corporate world, if you like, the boundaries has become ever more blurred to the extent where it's almost non-existent. It's not just the issue of second jobs. It's the issue of revolving door again. So I'll give you an example. Jeff Hoon. Jeff Hoon was the former New Labour Secretary of State for Defence in this country. When he was Defence Secretary, he handed a contract to Augusta-Westland, a defence company which specialises in helicopters to bastions of democracy like Saudi Arabia. Now, that was given with no competition, all above board though. Who did Jeff Hoon end up working for when he stood down? But as a director for Augusta-Westland. Another example, Patricia Hewitt, former Secretary of State for Health, the guardian of Labour's proudest achievement, the National Health Service. But who did she end up working for when she stood down? But amongst others, as director for the private healthcare firm Bupa. Another example, Alan Milburn, another Secretary of State for Health. He used to run a bookshop called Days of Hope, better known as Haze of Dope, for reasons I'm sure some of you can work out yourselves, a former left-wing firebrand. Secretary of State for Health, promoted privatisation and private sector involvement. Who did he end up working for when he stood down? But of course, for various private equity firms specialising in private healthcare firms now benefiting from the privatisation of the NHS. What does this do, this revolving door? It means that to become a minister is a springboard to a highly lucrative potential career in the private sector. It means you end up sharing common interests and mentalities with that world instead of seeing yourself primarily as the voice of your constituents. Now, if you don't accept these mentalities, then you tend to be either ignored or ostracised or ridiculed or demonised. If you're too young, it's naivety. If you're too old, you're a dinosaur. If you're too poor, it's envy. If you're too rich, it's hypocrisy. You literally cannot win. But this is partly enforced, as I said, by a media elite which polices zealously the terms of acceptable debate in this country. We don't have a free media in this country. We have a free media in the sense that our media is not directly run by the government. We're not North Korea, good, which is quite a low base, I would imagine. On the other hand, our media is dominated by a very small group of billionaire media moguls who have every reason to defend a status quo of which, of course, they are inextricably linked to, which they are fundamentally part of. No wonder, then, they focus so much of their resources scrutinising the behaviour of those at the bottom of society rather than looking at the sort of society and who dominates the society instead. Now, this is the point, and this is where, before I open up to discussion, this is, if you like, my plea. This establishment, in my view, doesn't receive the scrutiny that it deserves. And it doesn't for the reasons that I explained. But this establishment is far more triumphalist than ruling elites in the past. It genuinely thinks it's defeated its enemies. But I happen to think that triumphalism is complacency. And I look at our history to tell us why. Because the way we get change in this country isn't because of the goodwill and generosity of those with power. It's because of people organising from below, often at great cost and sacrifice instead. The powerful didn't wake up one day and think, oh, hang on a minute, I think I'll give women the vote. Instead, people had to organise. And if we look at our history, a history we don't talk about enough. We think of the toll puddle martyrs of the 1830s, agricultural workers in Dorset who tried to set up an early trade union, who were deported, transported to Australia as punishment. In response, hundreds of thousands of people mobilised and took to the streets in one of the first great political demonstrations in the history of this island, who signed a petition, again, up to 800,000 people until they got their return. Other trade unionists who fought for the dignity and rights of working people. The Chartists, partly the world's first great working class political movement. This college was partly founded in response to that movement, a movement which demanded democracy and emancipation, famously for working men. The suffragettes, celebrated, eulogised now, demonised and despised in their time. Terrorists, anarchists, they were called. Locked up in prisons, force-fed. Those who fought sexism and racism and homophobia, spat at in the streets, battened by police officers. Those who built the welfare state, the NHS, all things won in the teeth of determined and what seemed like overwhelming opposition from those with power. These rights, these gains which are now often under attack, these were won because of our ancestors. Our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers and grandfathers and our ancestors before them. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And that is the lesson that should give all of us who want change hope and should give this establishment fear. Because it shows that the illusion of every single era, that this is the way the world is, that nothing will ever change, is an illusion. That things do change if people have sufficient determination and courage and foresight, and they stand together on the basis that they have a common enemy who they're up against. I'll give you an example, actually. I said I'd embarrass them. I'll give you an example at the back of this room. I don't know if anyone's seen Pride, the film. Not cried like that since The Lion King, but that film is about LGBT solidarity with the miners' strike. Miners' strike's often portrayed as just this colossal, crushing defeat. In lots of ways it was, of course. But what that film shows is how much that struggle contributed to the emancipation of LGBT people in this country. And at the back, we've got Mike and Martin there, looking right, there they are, who co-founded Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, LGSA. A big round of applause, actually. So Mike was portrayed in the film. You can see from his glasses, he's from Accrington, for those who've seen it. But again, that was an example where it seems almost, when you're fighting against the status quo, it's like swimming against a very strong current. It's hard, it's difficult, it's exhausting. You want to give up often. And if you've got these voices all the time screaming it's pointless, you're going to lose, if you're being ridiculed, it's easy to give in. But my plea to you is to learn, for all of us, to learn from our ancestors, because they fought what seemed like far more insurmountable odds than those that we currently face today. And look at our society. Who would build such a society from scratch? Where the wealth of the top 1,000 people can double in 5 years, whilst the wage packets of working people can decline year after year for the longest period since Benjamin Disraeli was Prime Minister. Back in the 1870s, where hundreds of thousands of people are driven to food banks, unable to feed themselves in the 6th richest country on the face of the earth, where we sit here in the middle of this great, thriving, booming metropolitan city where 1 in 4 children are left in overcrowded homes, robbed of basic security and dignity, attacking their basic well-being and their health and their education. Where 5 million people in Britain are stuck on social housing waiting lists, deprived of their basic needs and aspirations to have a home for them and their family. Where young people are denied basic secure jobs and it's like, these 0-hour contracts, like a return to a supposedly banished era where dockers marched to the yard and stuck their hands up hoping to get work, often to go home disappointed. Now young people get text messages at 6 a.m. in the morning telling them if they're going to get any hours that day. No pensions. Forget about pensions, no paid leave, sick leave, maternity leave, nothing. How do you build a life? How do you build a family? How do you build a home? Where instead of looking at the future with optimism, this generation has to expect a worse lot in life than their own parents for the first time in 100 years. Where disabled people have their benefits stripped away. In order to get them back, are driven into the humiliating process of appeals with no guarantees at the end of it. I don't think anyone would build such a society from scratch. if they had the choice. And on that basis, those of us who accept that this is an unjust society, we have a responsibility to do something about it. And I think future generations will expect it of us. That we stop seeing injustice as a bit like the weather. You can complain about it raining, but there's nothing you can do about it. It's the way the world is. That's not how injustice works. Injustice is created by human beings. It's constructed. And as it is constructed, it can be removed by human beings as well. We don't have to live in this sort of society. This is a society of huge wealth and abundance and talent. And the idea of having a society institutionally, systematically rigged in favour of a tiny elite at the top, rather than a society organised on the basis of people's needs and aspirations, doesn't make any sense. It's not just unjust. It's not just irrational. It's unsustainable as well. So my plea is this. Let's not just accept this is an unjust society. Let's do something about it. And if our ancestors could do it, we can do it as well. We just need the same determination, fearlessness, courage, foresight. And if we do that, we can build a different sort of society. Not run in the interests of a small group at the top, but run in the interests of those who keep society ticking, working people. So that's my challenge. And if we do that together, by organising, by not being divided, by not turning our anger and frustration at each other, then we can build a different sort of society. So let's do it. Thank you.